Welcome to another episode of Working the Word, Series 2, where we're looking at what it means to live as a follower of Jesus. In the last episode, we looking at how God is already at work in our world. And today we want to look around in our world again, this time at the people that are in that world. It's a journey of discovery that we're on, not something that we've got all the answers to or ever expect to have the answers to.
I don't think it's something you can have all the answers to. I think part of it's more about the journeying and the learning than the having all the right answers.
And that brings a lot of relief when you don't have to have all the answers.
Even just not necessarily having to be right all the time.
Or even know what all the questions are, let alone the answers. We want to kick off today with a verse from 1 John chapter 2. John is writing, and in this letter he uses the word love 52 times, many more than any other book in the Bible. And he says, whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandment is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected.
It's kind of an interesting mirror in that often, the way they use language, if something gets said and then repeated for emphasis, and to have here this kind of, it's almost saying it twice. Whoever does not keep his commandments is a liar. So keeping his commandments is part of knowing him, but the love of God being perfected is what keeping the commandments looks like. And that's typically not how we understand and apply how law interacts in our life.
But it's how John in this letter does. And learning to love like God loves is really our whole purpose in this series. How do we love like God loves? And then he goes on, by this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says that he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. And I guess we're talking here about how Jesus walked when he was walking down here on earth.
And, it's one of the really clear examples of, Jesus coming down and being a representation of God's character. We actually have a whole bunch of information on how Jesus lived and interacted with people in his world.
And so today we want to look at how Jesus walked, particularly as he mixed with people, all kinds of people. There's this beautiful quote, the Saviour mingled with men as one who desired their good. He showed his sympathy for them, ministered to their needs, won their confidence, and then he bade them follow me.
Which is something that it can be really easy to get out of order, because for him, it wasn't a calling them to follow him right at the start. There was, like we were talking about last episode on, they were on a journey and he was understanding and let them be where they were on the journey. But at the same time, he's got all these other priorities, for their good, to help them, to minister to their needs, to see who they are and love them as they are without kind of putting hooks in.
And I think that ministering to needs without hooks is key.
And sometimes, particularly the way that historically we've understood it, there's always kind of been this sense of like an agenda. Like, we will do this good thing to get to.
I will become your friend and hope that you will join my club. And if you don't join my club, then I'll move on to
the next person.
The next person. And it leaves you with a sense of being used.
Which is very much not the kind of way, like, you know, Jesus was fine letting people walk away. Like, you know, there wasn't, like, you know, he might have felt sad watching them go, but there wasn't kind of, he wasn't trying to rope you in or anything.
And that's been God from the Garden of Eden on, giving people freedom. So let's have a look and see what we can learn about seeing people as Jesus saw them.
To be honest, I think this is one of the most beautiful things you could study, really.
It's been a very exciting week, just going through all 4 Gospels saying, well, who did Jesus meet? Let's make a list. How did he actually interact with them? And what a collection of people we have.
That's a lot. And I mean, this is just the ones that are recorded. Like, you know, at the end of John's Gospel, he says, Jesus did many more things. I suppose there wouldn't really be enough space to write it all down, but these are just the ones that we know of.
In fact, they're not all the ones. There's only 3 disciples there.
Yes.
But they represent the disciples. There's the goody-goody people like the Pharisees and the priests.
who also sometimes count as the not-so-great people.
And then there's the not-so-great people like tax collectors.
Lepers.
Sinners.
Gentiles. Who also kind of turned out to be the good people.
But actually tended to wrap around Jesus a whole lot more. And then there's the not very well people and the people who've got not very well family members. We've got Jews and Gentiles, the whole range there. And the question is, well, let's have a look at these people and say, how did Jesus mix with them? Well, why don't we start with a man who came to Jesus under cover of dark?
Nicodemus.
You know, do you say something? Do you make a statement when you come under cover of darkness?
There's sort of a degree of not really being willing to commit yet or be seen to be involved, that there's an uncertainty there. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, if you believe something but you don't stand out and stand up for it, there's kind of a, you know, whether the fear of the repercussions or the fear of, you know, what people might say if they knew is kind of trumping your sort of assurance in that thing.
Mm-hmm. And there's something that we're going to notice as we look at all these people. Maybe we ought to notice it first up. Each situation is unique. Jesus doesn't have a one-size-fits-all mode of operating.
He's very much encountering people exactly where they are.
That one size is not going to reach everybody. But in each case, Jesus is giving them what they need.
And that isn't always what they ask for.
And in the case of Nicodemus, it's certainly not what they ask for. Because he comes and says, Rabbi, we know that you're a teacher come from God, for no one can do these signs unless God is with him. Which is a way of sort of buttering the teacher up, isn't it?
It is, but there's also, like, I kind of feel like there's an uncertainty in the word still. Like there's, you know, he's coming under the cover of night, so there's a degree of uncertainty already. But the way Jesus responds to him is challenging him, which kind of, to me, feels like the way he's coming is going, we know this. This is sort of a baseline at which to start, but...
So Nicodemus is a leading Jewish...
He's one of the religious leaders.
He's one of the leaders.
One of the ruling council.
So he's got all the background. He knows the theology. He's still cautious and tentative about Jesus. He is ready to be taken
A little bit deeper. And, in a lot of cases, Jesus doesn't do this kind of challenging. But in this case, you've got a guy who's got the background for this, who clearly seeks him out and asks, well, he hasn't sort of asked a question at this point. Jesus is kind of anticipating a little bit. But he seeks out that contact. And you can kind of, I think he's seeking something deeper, which is where Jesus is calling him.
And Jesus doesn't disappoint him. This one really is the exception to the rule. And we'll come to the more common ones as we move in. Because Jesus basically hits him straight out and says, you need to be born again. Unless a person is born again, he's not going to see the kingdom, which is a little bit of a shock to Nicodemus' system. How can that happen? And Jesus said, well, look, if you can't get that, how are you going to get if I start to talk heavenly stuff? And then he begins to talk, and it is to Nicodemus that he says, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life.
And I think the verse that follows that we don't usually quote as much, but, God did not send his son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him. That, there's not the condemnation. That's not the point.
And so our picture of God here is going to be really critical. That Jesus didn't come on a mission to bring condemnation.
Which sort of is an interesting foundation for some of the stories we're going to come to a little bit later, where it kind of almost seems on the surface like Jesus is bringing.
There are certainly times where Jesus is going to challenge some of his more challenging customers.
But it's always from a context of loving and wanting to draw them deeper, which is what he's doing here with Nicodemus. He's sort of seeing, if Nicodemus is seeking him out, he's looking for something. And Jesus is kind of going, okay, you're looking, let's do some digging. And gets into just sort of the whole passage that he responds to Nicodemus with is just really a beautiful summary of what God's mission was, but what they hadn't got.
And it doesn't finally bear fruit until the crucifixion. And at that point, Nicodemus responds to that gospel invitation.
And sometimes, even that can be something that we forget a little bit. At this point, it kind of, after this, Jesus and his disciples wandered off. There's no kind of payoff. And it can seem like, nothing really happened. But there's kind of a process of growth where, seeds are sown, and it takes a while for them to kind of grow and think and decide what they're going to do with it.
Mm-hmm. And God is apparently willing to wait. It's the whole seed sowing thing. You put the seed in, you will not have any kind of plant tomorrow.
Or the day after.
Even the fastest growing radishes are going to be a while. Sprouts might be a little bit quicker, a week or two.
But one of the things that I see really consistently in the way that Jesus relates to people is he's doing a lot of seed sowing.
Mm-hmm.
Just dropping ideas in their minds and just kind of letting it grow at its own pace.
And planting things that make people ask questions. And Jesus did a lot of getting people to ask questions.
I mean, even here, Nicodemus comes and the basis of knowing he's a teacher is the miraculous signs.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus is wanting to draw him deeper into to thinking about the relationship and the context within which, God and the world interact. It's not just, signs. Whereas, Nicodemus had kind of latched onto the big flashy, and Jesus is directing him back to an inner way of being.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, maybe we could switch characters and say, well, who else was there? And maybe we can stick with the Nicodemus class for a moment or two. There's a young man in Mark chapter 10, that comes to Jesus.
He's covered in a couple of the Gospels, but I think Mark picks up some interesting things.
Mark picks up some things that Matthew doesn't. It's also in Matthew 19 for those who want to compare them. And a man runs up to Jesus as he's just starting out and asks him, "Good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Pretty important question and almost related to the Nicodemus one. And Jesus does engage with him. And he highlights the commandments, which were well known to the young man, lists some of them, and the young man is pleased. "Teacher, I've done all of these since I was just a little one."
But at the same time, there's he declares, "I've done these since I was a boy." And yet he's still here asking because there's a sense of there's something I don't have.
Mm-hmm. And again, Jesus takes him very deep.
But one of my favorite things about this is in verse 21, like we don't often get kind of this sort of glimpse. But he says, "Teacher, he declared all these things I've kept since I was a boy." And Jesus looked at him and loved him.
And that's an interesting little glimpse into how Jesus is operating.
So when he's, one thing you lack, go sell everything and give to the poor and you'll have treasure in heaven. It's not, he's not telling him off. He's not sort of saying, you screwed up and you're a horrible person. He's sort of saying, this will take you deeper. But he's coming at it from a context of love and I want you to have everything rather than, I want you to give everything up.
I want you to learn to love. We don't know the end of the story. We know that the immediate response is that the young man is disheartened.
He walked away sadly.
He went away because he had great possessions.
And one of the things I think with Jesus is that he recognizes where people are, but he also recognizes that spot that they really need to be challenged in.
And that's the way of love.
That, it's not, Jesus looks at him and loves him. That's a base. That's not in question. It's not conditional. That Jesus looks at him and loves him anyway, but at the same time loves him enough to call him to go a little bit deeper.
Which is challenging.
And there's this sense of he won't love any more or any less. Even if you try this and fail, even if you don't try this, it doesn't change. Jesus looked at him and loved him.
The love was there before there was any action. The love was there before there was any response.
And the idea that, even if you get this wrong, still going to love.
Even if you say no, the love is still going to be there.
And recognizing, in terms of the character of God, that love at the center of all of these encounters, I think really helps us to get sort of a deeper glimpse into the way Jesus interacted with people and the way God interacts with us. And the more we hang out with him, the more we interact with others kind of like him.
Obviously, he found Jesus an attractive person to go to. He was approachable.
Which is interesting because, if he's someone in the ruling class with great possessions, to go off and see this guy who basically doesn't have possessions, that is immediately, there's a hunger there, that, the wealth and the possessions aren't enough for him.
Sometimes the people Jesus met were challenging. And someone who's trying to find something to trip you up with would have to be described as challenging. And in Luke chapter 10, we have the story of a lawyer who came to put him to the test. he comes with a question. Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?
Which is similar to the rich young man. Like, we dealt with these stories a couple of weeks ago, but
We did.
like, in a lot of the stories that you go through, like, it's not really obvious, but the Pharisees just kind of happen to be there. So you've got the teachers of the law just sort of hanging around looking for holes, looking for places to kind of try and shake and like, in one sense, that's got to be kind of intimidating, just having, the religious leaders consistently just hanging around you all the time, waiting for you to say something or do something or...
But maybe it's also instructive in how you live when people are being that little bit more challenging.
And I think one of the things, like, we have a tendency to label people as difficult. And I don't actually think that's very helpful, because as soon as we label them difficult, how we act changes. And I think the other thing is, when we tend to label people as difficult, we're sort of just labeling them as an annoying person. We're not looking and digging into who they are and why they're asking the question, why they're difficult, why they're, behaving in the way they are. We're not being curious about who they are.
And with this one, Jesus doesn't give him an answer. He says, well, look, tell me, how do you read it? And gets a proper response.
Correct response, go on and do.
Love God with all your heart, love your neighbour as yourself. Yeah. And Jesus said, look, that's the right answer. And even in dealing with challenging people, Jesus looks for something to affirm.
And, there's sort of a patience of a stepping him through. Like, yes, you've got it. Like, yes, Jesus is kind of, he's being smart here. Like, yes, he's being loving, but he's also being smart, because if the guy is giving his own answers, he can't fault Jesus on what he's teaching, because Jesus hasn't actually taught in this case up until this point. But at the same time, he's very patient and affirming, and like, there's this idea of scaffolding, that you build on what is already there. Mm-hmm. So this guy already knows this, and Jesus is sort of affirming, okay, you know this, let's take that deeper.
Except the man digs the hole a little bit deeper. He wants to wiggle out of this one if he can. Who is my neighbour? And
I think there's also a sense, in terms of wanting to justify himself, he's kind of almost even seeking more reassurance. Like, Jesus has just said, yep, go do that. He's almost sort of seeking Jesus to go, you're one of the good guys, great, fantastic, you know what to do, you know who you're supposed to follow, all the things you're supposed to do. And, that's not really the way Jesus, like, there's always something a little bit deeper to go to. And he opened that door wide open.
He told the story of the Good Samaritan, and I think we covered that on a previous episode. He didn't answer the question that was asked.
He made the guy answer his own question after the story.
He answered the question the guy should have asked. Who am I neighbour to?
And I think, like, it can be a bit of a challenge if we're looking at how we apply this. It can be a little bit challenging because we don't quite have the same foreknowledge of, this is what they asked, but this is what they really needed to ask. But I think often we can actually get a bit of a sense of, like, they're lashing out at us over this, for example, but what might be underneath that. And I think starting to be curious and asking questions, we can actually see some of these things.
And that can also colour our praying. God, what's behind all this? Does this man really need an argument and an answer, or do they need to be heard? Given time.
Even sometimes love, like, a lot of the time when there's somebody lashing out, there's pain, there's trauma in that background. And being able to sort of see that person as, somebody who is inherently lovable but is broken in some way kind of helps you be able to see them as a person that you want to be a blessing to, and be interacting with them in a healing way, as opposed to just reacting to, like, a sort of self-centric like they're being annoying in my world, so therefore I will push back on their world. It's sort of being able to step into their world and understand and love them as
and
they
maybe they're hurting and the tendency is to hurt them more.
Because the way they are responding makes us kind of feel uncomfortable. And often our response is to kind of just push back, like, okay, well, if that's what you're giving me, here, have some more. Whereas sometimes going, okay, that's what you're giving me, let's put that aside. Let's look at what's behind that. Gets us a lot deeper, I think, in terms of being able to build those relationships and bring healing.
And listening is going to be a key part of that.
And like listening to understand, not listening to respond, which is something we don't always get right.
Straight after this comes another story. As Jesus meets some people that I guess are very good friends. If they're not now, they certainly are becoming that way. Because he enters a village and a woman named Martha welcomes him into their home.
Which is kind of interesting because you've immediately got, we know that Mary and Martha are sisters, but Martha opens her home and has a sister named Mary. It's not Mary and Martha opened their home. You've clearly got this delineation between them right at the start.
So we've got Mary, Martha, Lazarus. Martha's clearly a hospitable person. And maybe we will explore that more when we look at spiritual gifts in a week or two. And being the hospitable person that Martha is, she has to get something on the table.
All the preparations, cleaning up, making sure there's...
Because the teacher and his disciples have arrived.
And I mean, that's a fantastic thing. Like, it's arrived... She's clearly a hospitable person. This is what she does. He comes into the home and she cares. This is how people like her do this.
This is the right thing to do. This
is her thing. But I don't know that she's necessarily recognised that this isn't Mary's thing.
But she has an expectation that Mary is going to come out in the back room and help her.
And to be fair, within the context, that probably wasn't an unreasonable expectation. That's, she's a good Hebrew woman. This is that they're expected to be fulfilling this role, and Mary is not doing what a good Jewish woman is supposed to do.
So here is Jesus sitting on his chair, I suppose. Here around him are his disciples, and here among the disciples listening to Jesus is Mary.
And I kind of feel like there's a degree of a free spirit in her that just yes, she was helping, but then she was kind of listening and then just sort of found herself at the feet, just kind of taking it all in because nothing else in the world mattered. I'd say she probably started out helping Martha, but just kind of forgot about all of that because this was really important and she wanted to know.
There's a number of scholars, though, that have noted that what she is doing is actually taking the position of a student of a rabbi. And Jesus is letting it happen.
Jesus lets it go.
This is out of the ordinary.
And until Martha complains, Jesus doesn't say anything about it. And when Martha, you're worried, and Jesus says that you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is necessary, and she's chosen what is better, it will not be taken away from her. So when, push comes to shove, Jesus defends her and sort of, no, she's okay to be there.
That she has the right to sit and to learn at the feet of the rabbi. And this is almost a novel thing for a woman.
And particularly in the context of, sometimes we can get really caught up in doing the good things and serving and doing all the things we're supposed to do and miss kind of where we're supposed to be. You can still get off track by doing good things. And I think, for Martha, this wasn't off track. For Martha, she was doing what she's there to do. But with Mary choosing to do something that wasn't normal and to dive in, just sort of sit there listening and absorbing, for that to be affirmed it's a really powerful picture of Jesus, really.
And we're going to meet Mary particularly in an ongoing basis. And Jesus has big things that Mary is going to do. We do come across them again in John chapter 11. And again, we see Jesus interacting with people. This is the story of, I was going to say Lazarus.
Lazarus really only turns up at the end, though.
Lazarus is sick. Mary and Martha send a messenger to Jesus. You know, he's sick, you better come. Jesus hangs around for a few more days before heading there. By the time he gets there, Lazarus is in the grave. When he arrives, and I'm down at verse 21, he arrives at Bethany. Martha goes out and says to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Which is a fair enough complaint, I suppose.
I mean, it's a fair enough complaint. And you've also got, you know, if you're looking kind of between the lines there, there's still an aching there. Like, you could have stopped this. Like, you know, it's kind of even a little bit putting Jesus on the spot. Like, you know, he's dead because you weren't here.
You took your time, didn't you?
But at the same time, Jesus doesn't react to their, you know, her lashing out at him, essentially.
And Jesus has some words that maybe are comforting. Your brother will rise again. And Martha apparently has been listening even from the kitchen. I know that he will rise again at the resurrection on the last day. And to her, Jesus says, I'm the resurrection and the life.
And I think that there's a very specific, you know, Jesus says to her, Jesus is directly talking to her. Like, he's engaging with her on her level.
She then goes home and says to Mary, Jesus is here, he wants to see you. So Mary goes out.
Which is kind of interesting because, like, the way we've had the interactions with these sisters before, you would almost, like, outside the context of grief, it would have been Mary running out to meet him and Martha kind of finishing up at home. And in this case, you've got Martha coming out to do the hospitable welcoming thing, and Mary's just not got it in her right now.
And when Mary leaves the house, the people that are in the house think she's going back to the tomb to weep.
Which says that she's not sort of, you know, cool, calm, collected altogether.
That she's a mess.
A bit of a mess right now.
And when she gets to Jesus, she's got some words to say to him too. Verse 32, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Exactly the same words pretty much as
And
Mum.
yet Jesus responds in such a different way that, you know, instead of giving her an answer and, you know, asking with Martha, he's sort of said, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Like, he's engaging with Martha on a very kind of almost logical level and calling her to make that tiny step of faith. Whereas when Jesus sees Mary weeping and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was moved, asked, where have you laid him? And then, you know, they said, come and see. And then we've got that tiny verse, Jesus wept. So he does not actually respond to Mary's outburst.
He sits down and has a good cry with her.
And cries with her. And, like, it's another one of the verses I love just comes straight after. The Jews, you know, the people around him said, see how he loved him.
And so again, we've got this love coming out. Mary doesn't need to hear anything.
She doesn't need words right now.
Any words that Jesus says to her right now are going to be a waste of breath. And so he's done the most helpful thing he could do. He's
sat down with her.
And just had a good cry.
And just been with her. And, like, you know, the Jews are commenting on see how he loved him, but I also think there's an aspect of see how he loves her. Mm-hmm. That, you know, he's like, you know, he knew what he was there to do. He could have just gone, it's going to be fine. Don't, you know, calm down. It'll be fine. I'll just go raise Lazarus and ta-da, everything's fine. But he honors her feelings and her grief and sits with her in the grief, even knowing that
he's about
to fix that, but he doesn't rush through that part.
And this has been a very formative one. And it's in the next chapter that we meet Mary again and discover that she has actually caught on to what Jesus is all about. Because there's a feast. Lazarus is there. Martha is there. Mary is there. And
Mary is, again, not doing what Martha would probably want her to be doing, but...
And we're left to wonder what's happened in Mary's background. There's obviously some pain back there.
And I mean, like, you know, just even in the context we have, like, we know it was Martha's house. For it to not be Mary and Martha's house, it kind of suggests that it's complicated. And yet Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are all clearly kind of in the same spot. And we've got Mary essentially, I think Mary's a lot better at seeing through and seeing something deeper. Like she's kind of caught on to some of the spirit of this, even if she doesn't necessarily understand all the logic and the how it all works. She doesn't know what's going to happen, but there's something in her soul that's tapped into it.
And he says she's doing this to prepare for my burial. The disciples haven't caught on to that.
And I think, you know, she doesn't necessarily have that played out in her head. It's just something she knows she needs to do. And she's very much responding to just something drawing her that this is what I got to do. This is the best thing I have. You know, this perfume is quite possibly, you know, her dowry. Like their investment, financial investment in the future. This is like, it's not just kind of grab something off my dresser table kind of thing. She's giving to Jesus something really big and really, like, you know, this could be her future, her future financial security. It could be, you know, her chance at getting a decent husband if it's a dowry. We don't kind of know, but this is a significant thing she's bringing to his feet and just pouring out.
What she's really bringing is love. And the disciples are not yet at a point where they can see through Jesus' eyes.
See it as love, yeah.
They don't see it as love. They see it as waste.
And again, it's something we can kind of sometimes tap into, that we get into this doing all the right thing and, you know, we're doing the sums and, like, that gift you just gave could have, like, bought, like, 12 wells in Africa. You know, this could have given water to communities and villages and like, you know, this isn't an efficient use of... And sometimes we get caught up with, like the disciples did. And
guilt people rather than say, this is an act of love.
Or even just sort of recognizing the love in it and affirming that love. Mm-hmm. That sometimes it's not about doing the most logical thing or the you know, the thing that seems to make the most strategic sense. Sometimes it's about just on a human-to-human level showing love, even if that doesn't make sense.
And, you know, here we have Mary, a woman. And in that day and age, this was something out of the ordinary.
Even just like, you know, there's a dinner served in Jesus' honor. Lazarus was among those reclining. It's all guys around that table. Mm-hmm. Like, you know, Mary is supposed
Martha's catering.
Martha's catering. Mary's supposed to come in, you know, bring food and stuff. That's fine. But this is... And, like, you know, she's breaking perfume. There's no way of hiding this. There is no way you can hide a broken bottle of strong-smelling things in a small room. There's just everybody going to know.
Jesus is still going to be smelling of this stuff on
Yes, days later.
days later. He'd be smelling of it when he went to the cross.
Mm.
And he protects her. He affirms her. And this is not the first time that Jesus has had this relationship with a hurting woman.
Mm.
And I'm thinking of one back in John chapter 3. John chapter 3? 4.
There's the Samaritan woman in 4.
It's the Samaritan woman. So Jesus is taking a shortcut through Samaria.
Which is not something the good people of his time would consider kosher, but he has someone he's got to see.
He came to the town of Sychar, which is where Jacob's well was. A well that had been around for a long time, still there. Jesus is weary. He's very human. He takes the rest. You know, it's about lunchtime.
His disciples are in town.
And a woman from Samaria comes to draw water.
Which kind of, like, we initially know, like, you know, she's coming at an unusual time of the day, potentially to avoid the, you know, gossip circles of, like, just not have to deal with that.
And from a little bit further on, we understand that Jesus actually knows all about this woman. He later on is able to, in her mind, tell her everything she ever did. So he knows who's coming.
Mm. And I think, again, this is one of the stories that could be prefaced with, you know, and Jesus saw her and loved her.
But it could have been prefaced with Jesus saying to her, unless you're born again, you're not going to make the kingdom.
Mm. But it isn't.
That would have been true. You know, this woman particularly, she needed to be born again.
And I think sometimes that focus on truth can blind us to need. Because, yes, that is truth. But in terms of what she needed, that wasn't what she needed.
She needed to have value.
Mm.
She needed to be needed.
And, like, to give somebody personhood and dignity is a lot more important than making sure they've got their beliefs lined up.
And so he begins by asking for a favour. Could you get me a drink of water, please?
And, like, it's just even in that, there's sort of, he's making a space for her to take some initiative and for her to be the one who is able to help. Like, he's not, like, yes, we come into later him talking about living water, sort of drawing her deeper. So in some ways there is a tiny bit of a hook here, but it's not a hook that feels kind of icky. It's a hook where he's just kind of putting out a teaser and seeing if she'll jump in.
And we're not even told if he bought her, if she brought him a drink of water, because she is shocked to the bottom of her sandals. How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria? She knew the protocols. She knew the racism that existed in that culture.
And, like, you know, for her, this wasn't a new thing. This was, well, you know, this particular situation was a new thing, but this is just how things are. Mm-hmm. Like, I just have to live with it. I am a Samaritan woman. Like, you know, in this situation, I have no value here. And Jesus is kind of almost initially giving her that personhood, that human dignity. And then he just sort of kind of makes a teaser that just kind of like, wait, what makes you stop and think?
Yeah, if you knew who I was, you would have asked me for a drink.
Which puzzles her, like, but you've got nothing to, like, the water's down there and you don't have any But she's engaging with him. He's starting a conversation.
What does it mean when you actually engage someone in conversation?
There's very much a sense of you start to get a sense of who they are and you're listening to them. Like, you're creating a dialogue. It's not, I'm here to teach you. Like, Jesus has clearly got a lot of things he could teach her, but he's inviting her to step up and be an active part of this conversation too, and to take ownership of it, not just, sit down, I have some things to tell you.
Instead, he's giving to her that sense of value. With another little teaser. If you'd given me a drink, I'd be thirsty again. But if you had my drink, you'd never be.
You can almost, there's almost a slight teasing glint in Jesus' eye, not to hurt her, but just sort of, just kind of a slight cheekiness of like, let's dig in a little bit deeper.
Let's keep this conversation going.
Yeah.
And she's buying into it. Sir, give me this water. And she's still thinking the real stuff. And there's another teaser. Go and call your husband.
But like, again, you've got Jesus really encountering her where she is and just step by step calling her a little bit deeper.
Because she doesn't have a husband. And Jesus can say, well, that's correct. You haven't. You've had 5. And the one you've got now isn't your husband.
But I think, like, again, we've had the context of this conversation. If he'd led with that, it would have felt really judgy. Whereas because I've had this conversation and she's said, I don't have a husband, it's like, yep, that's truth. Like, there's kind of it's jaw-dropping here, but it's not the same judgy feeling it would have had if it was at the beginning. Like, you've had 5 husbands. The one you have right now isn't your husband.
You need to be born again. A tailor-made engagement.
And all of his encounters are tailor-made. They're exactly for where that person is at the time, what their needs are at the time. And
if she's coming at this time of day, it's possible that not many people engage with her, that she's on the outer. And here's someone who's actually taking the time. And she opens it up in a religious discussion. Which is interesting because,
you've got this Samaritan woman sort of popping in and having a theological discussion with him.
Well, he's obviously a prophet.
Yes. But again, you've got, him engaging with a woman in a way that guys of his time typically didn't actually engage with women.
Let alone with Samaritan. So Jesus is crossing a racial boundary. He's crossing a gender boundary. She wants to get into a little bit of an argument with him. Your faith says and our faith says, and Jesus cuts across it.
I also find it, though, interesting when the disciples turn back. Just verse 27, just then his disciples returned and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. But no one asked, what do you want or why are you talking with her?
Well, that can be called progress, can't it?
A little bit of progress and just kind of wait, what, just stand back. I don't know what's going on here, but something's going on. This doesn't compute, but... And
the woman leaves her jar. She doesn't even get the water that she came to get. She goes back into town. She says to the people, come and see a man who told me everything I ever did.
Which, probably when she left, she was a little bit sneaking out, trying to not draw attention. She comes back drawing attention. And Jesus, hasn't told her to do it. He didn't go and tell everyone. There was just something in her that's like, wait, there's something in this. I need to go and, it's drawing her to do that rather than telling her to do that.
It's been a long time since she's been treated with this respect. And they come out and suddenly there's a whole lot of people. Jesus spends time there. And the most unlikely people are some of the earliest people that come on board as followers of Jesus.
This is right at the beginning, and it still takes the disciples a while to catch on, but you're having these just sort of little reinforcements that this is a bigger picture than they thought it was going to be.
Mm-hmm. And there are so many encounters like this. Like we could go to the Canaanite woman that came begging him to heal her daughter. And while it looks like a little bit of a rough encounter, Jesus just challenged her a little bit. It's largely for the benefit of his disciples who previously wouldn't have been seen dead engaging with this person.
But I think you've also got, he's not just making a lesson for them, because there's a sense of disservice to her if it's just, he's using her to make a point.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas I think there's also a degree in which he's engaging her and challenging her to step out and say, to kind of really make that step of faith.
Mm-hmm.
To step up and go, I am a person of worth and it is okay for me to ask this. Even if, I don't fit this normal picture, it is okay for me to ask this. And Jesus isn't, Jesus kind of is almost calling her to make that affirmation. Instead of I'm not worthy for you to help, but which, we've got one of the rulers.
The centurion. I'm not worthy for you to come under my house. Just say the word.
So you've got this, centurion who, I'm not worthy. And then you've got this Canaanite woman who's willing to stand up to Jesus and go, you know what, actually I am worthy. Even, on the way to heal the centurion's, that was, he healed by the word because that was what is necessary. You've got other times where he does healing, but, if it's a leper, the lepers are outcast. Nobody has touched them for years because that makes you unclean. And he makes sure to touch them in the way he heals them. That touch is really important, that, he doesn't need to touch them to be able to do what he's got to do. And yet he knows that the touch is still necessary for what they need.
And that's that phrase again, isn't it? What is it that they need?
Yeah. And it's not just sort of necessarily looking at it from an external perspective of, okay, this person needs food, this person needs healing. Yes, in this encounter, say this leper person, what he needs is to be healed, yes. But he also needs human touch and human connection and being able to heal in a way that gives him what he longs for, not just what he needs. There's an abundance in there.
And we say, where do we go? We could talk about the disciples. Peter with his foot and mouth disease. And after 3 years, they still haven't got it.
I think a lot of the pieces are there. They just haven't put the pieces together yet. And I think some of that doesn't have, you've got Jesus being, arrested and crucified and coming back to life is a big part of putting those pieces together. And then they kind of have to sit and kind of process it for a bit. And even then, not all the pieces are there, but sort of the foundations are being laid. We're building up to something.
And Jesus doesn't expect that after 12 months, he should be seeing fruit. That he's not in a rush to move on and say, well, look, these guys are hopeless. Let's see if we can find someone who's a little bit more promising.
But at the same time, there's still that sense of being able to see the tiny steps of the journey that they're, that this is still transformative. It's just, it's taking a while for it to process and to become part of how they see themselves, how they see the world around them, how they live. It's taking time.
And even, the challenging disciple, Judas, we saw him being very inflexible with Mary. Even at the Last Supper, he's made an agreement to betray Jesus. And Jesus seems to be reaching out to him and reaching out to him even then. Giving him those clues. I know what you've done.
But again, it's not kind of a you're screwed kind of thing. He's not reaching out to Judas to try and save his own life. He's reaching out to Judas to try and save Judas.
If Jesus had just dropped a hint to the rest of them what Judas was up to.
Judas wouldn't have made it out the door.
Yeah, that knife that Peter had was going to use later in the evening. So Jesus was actually protecting Judas, even knowing what he was doing.
And like even knowing, the world of pain that he was about to be put in as the result of this man's decisions. He's protecting him from the disciples. He's focusing and he's still trying to save Judas.
He's still giving him reasons to believe. He's hinting, I know what you're up to. And all Judas had to do was to repent.
And I think one of the things, like it's a really strong picture of Jesus that doesn't come through as much, but even to the people who are directly hurting him, who are directly causing him pain, there's still that sense of love that, even if you're hurting me, I don't care, I still love you. Do you think that hurting me would make me love you any less?
And that was the message that Judas needed to hear.
And I think it's a message that a bunch of them needed to hear. When Jesus reinstates Peter, Peter is long past it. He doesn't deserve this, and he knows he doesn't deserve this. And I kind of wonder if he's been lingering at the back just a little bit, trying not to directly make contact because I've past the point of no return.
Shame.
And Jesus never uses shame, ever. Even when he's going after the Pharisees, he still never uses shame, even though sometimes maybe it would be justified. He's still reaching out. I love the way that the Gospel according to Matthew videos portray Jesus in the woe to you moment. That it's not, just him exploding in anger. It's heartbreak. That, if you had only, if you could see, if you only understood more deeply, it would be so much more full, but you're not seeing, and it's breaking his heart rather than just him exploding in you idiots.
And I wonder if this would be a good moment just to mention those Matthew videos that take the Gospel of Matthew, use the Gospel as the script, and give us insight into Jesus interacting with people.
And there's also an interesting book that goes along with that. I think it's called In the Footsteps of Jesus, which is written by Bruce Marciano, who was the guy who played Jesus. And it's basically his journey through encountering the character of Jesus and figuring out how you do this, trying to get into the heart and the character of Jesus to be able to portray him, and just some of the insights he got, just about the joyfulness of Jesus. There was one scene where they were filming and one of the actors who was playing a Pharisee was an older guy and was sort of struggling with the terrain and couldn't see properly, couldn't wear glasses in a period production. And so Jesus just put his arm around the Pharisee and was walking along, just sort of helping him in the road. And just these little glimpses they were getting of Jesus actually being a real person, encountering people. And, even though this Pharisee's probably been trying to trick him out, he still loves him. He's like, wait, I don't want you to fall over. Let me help you.
And now that's not actually in the film itself, but it was.
Oh, but some of that is. But there are also little moments that are told in the book that came outside, the woe to you scene. In that he wasn't sort of super conscious. He knew his lines and everything, but just this wave of sorrow took over, and he found himself at the end on his knees sobbing with one of the disciples looking after him. And just sort of, he realized, oh my goodness, it kills him. It's not just, he's just frustrated because they're still not getting it. It's heartbreaking to him.
There are so many characters.
There really are.
That we could look at. The one that I had next on my list was Zacchaeus. A man who was an outcast in town simply because of his job. He worked for the Romans. He collected taxes.
Matthew is the same.
Matthew is the same. And Jesus comes to Matthew and says, come follow me. And obviously we don't know the background of that. But the next thing we find, Jesus is attending a party at Matthew's place. He's got all his tax collector and other sinner friends.
Who all feel perfectly at home with this guy being around, which I doubt they would have felt if it was, one of the typical Pharisees coming over for a party. Everyone would be like, no, I'm busy tonight.
That there was something about Jesus, his approachability, that made all this worthwhile.
And I think, once you start seeing that just fierce love, you start kind of getting a deeper glimpse for these encounters. He doesn't always just kind of walk around being a nice guy, teaching things, healing people. Isn't this lovely? And sometimes the depictions we give of him are of either him being sort of, detached and, with a halo and just kind of, separate from the people or...
And the number of occasions where Jesus healed someone, and we really haven't gotten to the healings. And then when it was all over, said, now, see that you don't tell anybody. That it wasn't a showmanship thing. It was not, well, look, I've done this and now this is what I expect from you. And
there's a degree of, building fame or status or, reputation. And, when the Pharisees are trying to destroy your reputation, it's would be entirely reasonable to go, just let people know I did this. Whereas, Jesus is like, this is for your benefit alone.
And you've got the time when he fed the 5,000. Jesus understood that hungry bellies don't hear very well.
Yes.
And then he said, well, time to go.
And it would have been entirely reasonable to go, well, they should have prepared better, it's on them. And yet he doesn't. He just kind of goes, well, this is what they need.
And even with Caiaphas and the council, we haven't got to things like where he went into the temple and cleansed the temple.
Which is one that can be a little bit confronting initially for a lot of us because, suddenly you've got this Jesus who's been walking around and healing people and, loving the kids and being, affirming of women. And suddenly he's going into the temple and just kind of making a mess.
He's tipping over the tables, letting the animals go, the birds fly away.
And it's chaos. And typically our response is like, ooh, there was some injustice, but did it really justify that kind of
violence?
But the thing is, Jesus isn't just losing his temper here. Jesus, this is the day after the triumphal entry. Jesus actually, after the triumphal entry, comes in, has a look around, goes away. He's not just walking in and losing it. And even when he comes back and does kind of rip the temple to bits, it's not so much an anger. I don't think anybody would have been hurt. He wasn't out to hurt people. But there's almost kind of a mama bear. These are my people. And
this is my house.
This is my house, and you were abusing them and exploiting them in my name, and that is not on. So, for the respectable people who, were willing to overlook a bit of injustice and it's a bit dicey, but it's a system. For them, this is highly disruptive and disturbing, and Jesus is disturbing the peace.
For the ordinary people.
For the ordinary people who are being abused and oppressed, this is liberating. This is Jesus going, this system is broken and I'm going to make sure that these people see it's broken. You've been living under this broken system, but everybody's been pretending it's not broken. And Jesus is kind of making it so that they can't pretend it's not broken.
And there's very much a justice issue. It doesn't go over well with the hierarchy.
But the hierarchy are the ones who are benefiting from it staying the way it is.
And in a sense, Jesus is also reaching out to the hierarchy. And what else can he do that's going to get their attention?
He's been walking around and doing kind, gentle, small things.
He's even raised the dead, and that only made them want to kill him more.
And he's just continually reaching out, challenging them. That it's not, he's out to, he's just there to be destructive. He's there to kind of challenge, the leaders who are benefiting. He's there to challenge the system. And he's there even to challenge the people who've been oppressed by the system, that this isn't how it's supposed to be. You're not this isn't supposed to be done in my name.
To bring comfort to the people who are being oppressed and held in bondage.
And I think that's something that we don't necessarily pick up so much when we're looking at how we go on to live as Christians, that, sometimes it requires gentle, healing love. Sometimes it requires a fierce love. And we don't engage with that as much. And
it takes wisdom to know the difference.
It does.
So each situation we've looked at was unique, and there are so many more that are on my list.
I mean, there's 4 Gospels full of people, Jesus encountering people.
And we've looked at all of them. In no 2 cases has the same approach been used.
Even when they come asking the same question, Jesus still responds in a different way.
He's saying, what do they need? And he's responding, the things that I see coming out as Jesus is looking at these people through his eyes, is a patience, a gentleness.
And I think even on the day when he was, messing up the temple, I think there's still a gentleness there in terms of a protective gentleness.
There's a respect of human dignity.
Even for the people who weren't considered to have that dignity. And I think that overall perspective of humans having dignity is something that really needs to be inherent. Human beings have value. It doesn't matter what, they don't have to earn it. They inherently have it.
And it doesn't matter whether it's a leader of the Pharisees like Nicodemus, whether it's a Samaritan multiple divorcee.
Whether it's a kid, it doesn't, we
didn't look at the children, did we?
Yes. That there is way too much. Go and study it, go and have a look at it. Just look through the Gospels through the eyes of, how Jesus,
how Jesus treated people.
We could do a whole series just on that. But
that would be fun. And there is what I call disinterested benevolence. Now, maybe this is not a familiar term. Disinterested is not the same as uninterested.
He wants their good, but the disinterest, he doesn't have an investment in this. He's not trying to get something out of this.
He doesn't say, what's in this for me? I'll heal you if you'll, that whether they're going to come and follow him or whether they are going to say, crucify him, that he is going to do good.
And he's still extending love, regardless of who they are, what they're doing,
what their history is, what their nationality is. He doesn't ask that question. He says, what can I do to be a blessing to this person? And as we come to the end of his teaching, at the end he challenges us. He said, look, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me. And the righteous will say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink?
Which is kind of interesting because, if you look at the ones on the left and the ones on the right, they actually say the exact same thing. Wait, we didn't see you. But the ones on the who didn't do this, they didn't see God and didn't see the reason to do anything. Whereas these guys didn't see God, but they saw people who were inherently loved and valued by God and needed to do something.
And his response, as you did it or didn't do it to one of the least of these of my brothers, you did it or didn't do it to me. As we walk around our community and we see the person on the street, they haven't got anything. Are we seeing God?
Or even more when somebody cuts you off in traffic, when you get an annoying phone call at dinner time. The just sort of the people that it's but they were annoying. It's okay to maybe
someone we respond to on social media?
Yeah.
Are we seeing them as if we're doing it to God? And that's you're seeing through.
And even just not necessarily just seeing as though we were doing it to God, seeing them how God sees them.
And that's what we hope we've come away with today. And maybe this is a prayer that we can pray. God, give me the insight to understand how you see this person, to recognise their value in your eyes, and give me the heart to treat them that way. Take that prayer, pray it, and let God show you how to see people through his eyes. We look forward to seeing you as we continue on this journey of discovery and working the word. God bless you.